Arizona Territory. 8 to 7 to 8, the Miller Ranch sat alone on a stretch of land so wide that a man could ride half a day and still see nothing but grass and dust. It had once been a thriving place. Dozens of horses, hundreds of cattle, cowboys riding the fields from sunrise to sunset. But that had been many years ago. Now, only one man remained, Thomas Miller. He was 68 years old. His beard had turned white long ago, and the deep lines in his face told the story of a hard life, spent under the unforgiving sun of the frontier. Most men his age had moved into town, but Thomas refused. This land had belonged to his father, and his father's father before him. He had built the ranch house with his own hands when he was a young man. He had buried his wife under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, and he intended to die on this land as well. That evening, he sat in his rocking chair on the porch. The slow creak of the wood echoed in the quiet air. In his hand was a tin cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the plains in deep shades of orange and red. The wind moved slowly across the fields, carrying the dry smell of dust and grass. Thomas stared across the land with calm eyes. To anyone else, the ranch looked peaceful, but Thomas had lived on the frontier too long to trust peaceful moments. He had learned something very important during his years in the West. Trouble rarely announced itself. It appeared quietly, like distant riders on the horizon, and sometimes, by the time you noticed them, it was already too late. Thomas slowly leaned forward in his chair. His eyes narrowed. Far out on the open land, something moved. At first it looked like nothing more than shadows shifting in the distance. But then he saw the dust, 5 thin trails rising into the evening air. Riders, coming straight toward the ranch. Thomas did not panic. He had seen men like this before. Outlaws, cattle thieves, bandits looking for easy targets. And an old rancher living alone was exactly the kind of target they liked. He took a slow breath and stood up. His joints cracked softly as he straightened his back. Then he looked toward the barn. The large wooden structure stood about 50 yards from the house, old, weathered, and quiet. Most people believed it held nothing but tools and old saddles. That belief had protected Thomas for many years. But tonight, things might be different. The riders were getting closer now. Thomas could see their silhouettes clearly against the fading light. 5 men, all armed, all confident. They believed they had found easy prey. Thomas Miller watched them for another moment. Then he slowly turned and walked toward the barn. If the bandits wanted trouble, they were about to find it. The 5 riders did not rush. Men like them rarely did. They had learned long ago that fear was stronger when it moved slowly. Their horses walked across the dry land, hooves pressing softly into the dust of the Arizona plains. The sun was almost gone now, leaving long shadows stretching across the ranch yard. From a distance, the place looked exactly as they expected. Quiet, still, defenseless. The leader of the group rode slightly ahead of the others. His name was Cole Braddock, a tall man with a dark coat and a scar running across the side of his jaw. He studied the ranch carefully as they approached. One house, one barn, a few cattle fences. Nothing impressive, nothing threatening. He smiled slightly. "Easy pickings," he muttered. Behind him, one of the younger bandits leaned forward in his saddle. "You sure the old man lives alone?" he asked. Cole nodded. "We watched the place 2 days. No riders, no ranch hands, no guards." He pointed toward the house. "Just the old man." Another bandit laughed. "Then this will be quick." But Cole Braddock kept watching the ranch. Something about the place bothered him. It was too quiet. Even animals seemed strangely calm. Most ranches reacted when strangers arrived. Dogs barked. Horses moved. Cattle stirred. But here, nothing. The ranch looked like it was waiting. Still, Cole pushed the thought aside. He had robbed dozens of ranches across 3 territories. Old men living alone did not frighten him. The riders continued forward until their horses crossed the wooden fence line. Dust drifted slowly behind them, and that was when they saw him. The old cowboy stepped out from the barn. Thomas Miller walked slowly into the open yard, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. His hat was pulled low over his eyes. He looked exactly like what they expected. Old, slow, harmless. Cole Braddock stopped his horse about 20 feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind passed gently across the yard. Thomas looked at each of the riders calmly. 5 men, all armed, all confident. Then he spoke in a quiet voice. "You boys look lost." The younger bandit laughed loudly. Cole smirked. "We ain't lost, old man." He gestured toward the house. "We're here to collect." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "Collect what?" "Anything worth taking." Another bandit leaned forward in his saddle. "Horses, cattle, money." Cole watched the old rancher carefully. Most men showed fear at this moment. They begged. They panicked. They tried to run. But Thomas Miller did none of those things. Instead, he glanced slowly toward the barn. Just for a second, the movement was small, almost unnoticeable. But Cole Braddock saw it, and something about that glance made the scarred outlaw narrow his eyes. "What's in the barn, old man?" Cole asked. Thomas looked back at him calmly. "Just horses." The younger bandit grinned. "Oh, perfect." He kicked his horse forward. "Let's take a look." But before he could move farther, Thomas spoke again. His voice was still calm, but now it carried a strange weight. "You boys might want to think twice about that." The bandits laughed. Cole leaned down slightly in his saddle. "And why is that?" Thomas looked at the barn once more. Then he said something that made the men pause. "Because once that door opens, things are going to get loud." For a moment, no one moved. The wind pushed a swirl of dust across the yard. Then the youngest bandit laughed again. Loud? He pulled his revolver halfway from its holster. "Old man, the only loud thing here is going to be this." Thomas Miller slowly turned toward the barn doors. The massive wooden structure stood silent in the fading light. He placed one hand on the heavy handle, and for the first time that evening, the old cowboy smiled. For a few seconds, the ranch yard remained completely silent. 5 armed bandits sat on their horses, and one old cowboy stood in front of the barn doors. The air felt heavier now. Even the wind seemed to slow down as the sun disappeared behind the distant hills. Cole Braddock studied the old man carefully. Something about him did not fit the situation. Thomas Miller should have been afraid. He should have been begging. But instead, he looked calm, too calm. Cole shifted slightly in his saddle. "Go ahead," he said. "Open it." The youngest bandit laughed. "Yeah, old man, let's see those horses." Thomas rested his hand on the large wooden door. The barn was old. The thick wood was dark from decades of sun and dust. Heavy iron hinges held the doors in place. Most men would have struggled to move them, but Thomas pulled slowly. The hinge groaned loudly. A long, deep, creaking sound echoed across the ranch. The door opened only a few inches at first. Darkness waited inside. The bandits leaned forward slightly in their saddles, trying to see. Dust drifted through the narrow opening. Cole frowned. He expected to hear horses shifting or chains moving, but the inside of the barn was completely silent. Too silent. "Open it wider," Cole ordered. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he pulled harder. The massive doors slowly separated. The creaking grew louder, wood scraping against wood, metal hinges grinding under the weight. Finally, the doors opened enough for the fading sunset light to spill into the barn. The bandits stared inside. At first, they saw nothing, just shadows, rows of wooden beams, old tools hanging from the walls. Then the light moved farther into the darkness, and shapes began to appear. Horses, but not just a few, dozens. Large stallions filled the interior of the barn. Strong animals, broad shoulders, powerful legs. They stood quietly in the dim light, watching. The youngest bandit whistled. "That's a lot of horse flesh." Another outlaw grinned. "Old man been hiding a fortune in here." Cole Braddock remained silent. His eyes moved slowly across the animals. Something was wrong. These were not ordinary ranch horses. They were too big, too muscular. Their coats were scarred. Their ears twitched constantly, and several of them stomped their hooves against the ground as the strangers approached. Thomas stepped calmly to the side. The bandits noticed something else now. Every single horse inside the barn was already saddled. Cole narrowed his eyes. "You expecting company, old man?" Thomas shrugged slightly. "Not exactly." One of the bandits laughed. "Well, that's mighty convenient for us." He swung his leg over his saddle and jumped down. Dust puffed beneath his boots. He walked toward the barn confidently. "You boys see this? These horses are worth more than the whole ranch." The others laughed, but Cole was still watching Thomas. The old cowboy had stepped completely away from the door now, and his eyes were not on the bandits. They were on the horses. The animals had begun to move slightly, their hooves scraping against the barn floor, their muscles tightening. Thomas spoke quietly. "You boys ever ride war horses before?" The bandits laughed again. "Horses are horses, old man." Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, some horses are trained for work, some for racing." He looked at the powerful stallion standing in the barn. "And some are trained for war." The young bandit who had stepped down walked deeper into the barn. He grabbed the reins of the closest horse. The stallion instantly jerked its head upward. Its ears flattened. The animal snorted loudly. The bandit pulled harder. "Stupid animal," he muttered. That was when Thomas spoke again. "Let go of that horse." The bandit ignored him, and then everything happened at once. The stallion reared violently. Its hooves slammed into the wooden stall. The sudden explosion of movement startled the other horses. They began stomping, snorting, kicking the ground. Dust rose into the air inside the barn. The bandit stumbled backward. "What the—" But before he could finish his sentence, Thomas Miller reached for the rope hanging beside the door and pulled it. A loud bell rang inside the barn. The sound echoed like thunder through the wooden structure. Instantly, the horses erupted into motion. The bell echoed through the barn like a thunderclap. For a split second, the bandits froze. Then the horses exploded into motion. Powerful stallions slammed their hooves against the wooden floor. Dust shot into the air as muscles flexed and bodies surged forward inside the tight barn space. The young bandit who had grabbed the reins stumbled backward in shock. What the hell? Before he could finish, a stallion kicked violently against the stall gate. The wood cracked loudly. Another horse reared high, its hooves striking the air just inches from the man's head. The bandit dove aside, falling hard into the dirt outside the barn. Cole Braddock's horse immediately began to panic. The animal sensed the chaos. Its ears flattened, and it started stepping nervously in place. Cole grabbed the reins tightly. "Hold your horses!" he shouted, but it was too late. Inside the barn, the massive animals were no longer standing calmly. They were moving, circling, snorting. Their hooves slammed the ground like drums of war. Thomas Miller stood beside the door, completely still, watching, waiting. Another loud crack split the air as one of the stall gates broke open. The stallion burst forward into the open section of the barn. Its saddle straps swung as the powerful animal charged toward the light spilling through the doors. The bandits stared in disbelief. "What is he doing?" one of them shouted. Cole understood first. His eyes widened. "He's releasing them!" Another stall gate snapped. Then another. One by one, the powerful animals burst free from their stalls. Dust filled the barn as dozens of hooves pounded the wooden floor. The young bandit scrambled backward on his hands and feet. "Stop them!" But Thomas did nothing. Instead, he calmly walked to the side of the barn door and lifted a second rope. Cole saw it too late. "Don't!" Thomas pulled. Another bell rang, this one louder, longer. The sound seemed to ignite the animals completely. The stallions surged forward together. 30 powerful horses thundered toward the open doors of the barn. Their hooves crashed against the ground like rolling thunder. Dust exploded into the evening air as they burst into the ranch yard. The ground shook. The bandits' horses panicked instantly. One of them reared violently, throwing its rider backward into the dirt. Another horse spun wildly, nearly colliding with another bandit. Cole fought to keep control of his mount. "What the hell kind of horses are these?" Thomas finally answered. His voice remained calm. "War horses." The stallions surged across the yard like a living storm. They were not running randomly. They moved together, trained, disciplined, and they were charging straight toward the bandits. The youngest outlaw screamed, "Move!" But panic had already taken control. Their horses, terrified by the sudden thunder of hooves, refused to obey. One bandit tried to fire his revolver. The loud gunshot only made things worse. The stallions scattered in different directions, kicking and charging through the yard. One powerful horse slammed into a bandit's mount, knocking the rider sideways in the saddle. Another rider lost control entirely and crashed into the wooden fence. Dust filled the air so thick that the ranch yard vanished inside a swirling cloud. Through the chaos, Thomas Miller slowly stepped forward. He walked calmly into the dust storm of hooves and shouting men. The bandits were no longer in control. The ranch was no longer quiet. The trap had been sprung, and the old cowboy had not even touched a weapon yet. The ranch yard had become a storm of dust and thunder. 30 powerful stallions raced across the open ground, their hooves pounding against the dry earth like rolling thunder. The bandits had completely lost control. One of them had already been thrown from his horse and now crawled across the dirt, trying desperately to avoid the charging animals. Another rider fought with his mount as it spun wildly in panic. The horses were not attacking the men directly, but they were doing something far worse. They were terrifying every animal in the yard. Cole Braddock barely managed to stay in his saddle. His horse bucked violently beneath him as the herd surged past. "Hold them!" he shouted, but none of his men could hear him over the chaos. Dust filled the air so thick that the ranch house was barely visible anymore. Through the swirling cloud, Cole saw the old cowboy walking slowly across the yard. Thomas Miller moved calmly between the running horses. The animals did not crash into him. They moved around him, as if they knew him, as if they trusted him. Cole's eyes narrowed. "This old bastard planned this," he muttered. One of the bandits finally managed to steady his horse. He wiped dust from his eyes and spotted the old cowboy walking calmly. Through the chaos, anger flashed across the outlaw's face. "You think this scares me?" He pulled his revolver from its holster. The metal glinted briefly in the fading sunset light. He raised the weapon toward Thomas. Cole saw it instantly. "Wait!" But the bandit had already pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded across the ranch yard. The loud crack echoed against the barn and fences, but the bullet never reached its target. At the exact moment the outlaw fired, one of the massive stallions surged between them. The bullet struck the saddle horn strapped to the horse. Sparks flashed. The horse reared violently, screaming as the metal rang from the impact. The outlaw stared in shock. "What the?" Before he could fire again, the stallion slammed its hooves down in front of him. The sudden movement spooked the bandit's horse. The animal bolted sideways. The rider lost his balance instantly. He crashed hard into the dirt. His revolver flew from his hand and disappeared somewhere in the dust. Cole Braddock finally forced his horse to turn toward the old man. The herd was beginning to spread out now. The violent surge of chaos was slowly settling, but the message had already been delivered. This ranch was not defenseless, not even close. Cole rode forward slowly. The dust drifted around him as his horse approached Thomas Miller. The old cowboy had finally stopped walking. He stood calmly in the center of the yard. The last rays of sunlight painted the sky behind him in deep shades of red and gold. For a moment, neither man spoke. The herd of stallions circled the ranch slowly now, snorting, watching. Cole glanced around at the scene. Two of his men were already on the ground. Another struggled to calm his terrified horse. The raid had gone very wrong, very quickly. Cole looked back at the old rancher. "You trained them," he said quietly. Thomas nodded once. "Took years." Cole studied the animals carefully. War horses, disciplined, strong, and loyal to the man standing in front of him. The outlaw leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "You expect me to leave because of a few horses?" Thomas looked at him for a moment. Then he answered, "No." The wind moved softly across the ranch yard. Dust drifted through the air between them. Thomas tilted his head slightly toward the barn. "I expect you to leave because of what's still inside." Cole frowned. His eyes slowly moved toward the dark barn entrance. "What's inside?" he asked. The old cowboy finally allowed a small smile to appear beneath his beard. "You really want to find out?" For several long seconds, the ranch yard was quiet again. The dust slowly settled back onto the ground. The stallions circled the yard, snorting softly, their powerful bodies still tense from the sudden chaos. Cole Braddock remained in his saddle, staring at the dark opening of the barn. "What's inside?" he repeated. Thomas Miller did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the barn entrance. His boots pressed softly into the dusty ground. Behind him, the war horses followed with their eyes. They did not run any more. They simply watched. The old cowboy stopped a few steps from the doorway. The inside of the barn had grown darker now that the sun had almost disappeared behind the hills. Only faint shadows moved between the wooden beams. Cole studied the opening carefully. "You trying to scare me, old man?" he asked. Thomas shook his head slightly. "No." His voice remained calm. "I'm trying to warn you." One of the bandits, the one who had fallen earlier, finally stood up again. He wiped dirt from his coat and spat angrily into the dust. "Enough of this," he growled. He reached down and grabbed his revolver from the ground. "I'm going in there." Cole did not stop him. The outlaw walked toward the barn cautiously, gun raised. He stepped past Thomas, who didn't even look at him. The man entered the dark interior slowly. The rest of the bandits watched closely from the yard. At first, nothing happened. The outlaw disappeared into the shadows between the stalls. The sound of his boots echoed softly against the wooden floor. Then his voice called out from inside, "Just old Junkin here." He laughed. "I think the old man's bluffing." Cole relaxed slightly in his saddle, but Thomas Miller still had not moved. He was staring into the darkness of the barn, waiting. The bandit inside walked deeper into the shadows. He pushed aside an old wooden crate with his boot. Dust rose into the air. Then suddenly the laughter stopped. The men outside noticed it instantly. Silence filled the barn. A few seconds passed. Cole frowned. "Hey!" No answer came from inside. Another moment passed. Then they heard it. A slow metallic sound. A heavy chain sliding across wood. The bandits outside exchanged uneasy looks. "What is that?" one whispered. The stallions in the yard reacted first. Several of the animals lifted their heads sharply. Their ears turned toward the barn. They snorted uneasily. Inside the darkness, something large moved. The heavy sound of metal echoed again. Then the bandit's voice returned, but this time he was not laughing. "What is this?" Another metallic sound followed, a deep, grinding noise. Then a loud bang echoed from inside the barn. The outlaw stumbled backward out of the doorway. His face had turned pale. "What did you see?" Cole demanded. The bandit shook his head slowly. His voice trembled. "Those aren't just horses in there." Cole's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The man swallowed hard. "There's something else." Thomas Miller finally spoke again. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard like a warning. "I told you, boys." He slowly turned toward them. "You should have ridden away while you still had the chance." Cole looked from the old cowboy back to the dark barn. The wind pushed dust across the yard again, and somewhere inside the shadows, something heavy moved. The ranch yard had grown quiet again. The dust slowly settled back onto the ground. The stallions moved calmly now, circling the fences in the open yard, their breathing heavy but controlled. Cole Braddock sat in his saddle, staring at the barn. The bandit who had gone inside still looked shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped sweat from his face. Cole's voice came out low and impatient. "What did you see?" The man hesitated. Then he spoke quietly. "There's rifles in there." Cole frowned. "What?" "Crates of them." The bandit pointed toward the dark interior of the barn. "Not just a few. Dozens. And boxes of ammunition." The other outlaws looked at each other. Thomas Miller leaned against the wooden doorframe calmly. Cole turned slowly toward him. "You running an army out here, old man?" Thomas shook his head. "No, just preparing." "For what?" Cole asked. Thomas looked across the plains stretching beyond the ranch. The last light of the day faded behind the hills. "Ah, for men like you." The wind moved softly through the ranch yard. Cole let out a quiet laugh. "You expect me to believe you can fight 5 armed men with a barn full of rifles?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly stepped into the barn. The outlaws tensed instantly. After a moment, he returned, carrying something in his hand. A long rifle, old but well cared for. He checked the chamber calmly. The metal clicked softly. Then he leaned the rifle casually against his shoulder. Cole studied him. "You planning to shoot us all?" Thomas looked at the stallions standing around the yard, then back at the bandits. "No, I'm planning to give you a chance." The outlaws laughed, but Thomas continued speaking. "I fought in 2 wars. I've buried friends, and I've watched too many men die over pride." His voice remained steady. "So here's what's going to happen." He gestured slowly toward the open land beyond the ranch. "You and your boys turn those horses around. You ride out of here. You never come back." Cole's smile slowly faded. "And if we don't?" Thomas lifted the rifle slightly. The movement was small, but every bandit noticed. "Then the next sound you hear, or won't be a warning bell." The ranch yard fell silent again. Cole looked around. 2 of his men were still on the ground, their horses nervous. The war stallions circling the ranch like silent guards. And the old man, standing there as if he had already decided how this night would end. Cole exhaled slowly. Then he turned his horse slightly. He looked back at the other bandits. "We're leaving," one of them protested. "Boss," Cole cut him off. "I said we're leaving." The outlaw glared at the old cowboy one last time. Then he pulled his horse around. One by one, the bandits turned their mounts toward the open plains. Their horses trotted nervously away from the ranch. Cole Braddock was the last to leave. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard. "You know something, old man?" Thomas waited. Cole nodded slowly. "You picked the right place to make your stand." Then he rode away. The sound of hooves slowly faded into the darkening plains. The ranch yard became quiet once more. Thomas Miller stood there for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle. The stallions slowly returned toward the barn. The wind moved gently through the fences. Another quiet night on the frontier. The old cowboy walked back to the porch, sat down in his chair, and watched the empty horizon. Because out here in the West, peace never lasted long. But tonight, the ranch was still his.